Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones. The unvisited ones. The cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we welcome back to the show one of my very favourite guests, Dr. Becca Tarnas. And, for her third appearance, we thought we might do something a little different. Because we are getting toward the end of the year and, casting a side eye at the next one, Becca and I sort of gather up some of the material we have previously discussed and put it to service, providing inspiration and fortification for 2020. The Lord of the Rings, in particular, has much medicine on offer when it comes to facing seemingly insurmountable odds. But it is really everywhere in Tolkien's perspective and life experience. So let's do it. In a hole in the ground, there lived a podcast. Dr. Becca Tarnas, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me back on again.
Oh, literally any time, of course. And in between your last visit and this one, you have published a book. Congratulations on your book.
Thank you so much. Yes, it's hard to believe that it's real and here, and I just love holding it. It's this amazing feeling when something that's been inside you is suddenly out in the world in physical form.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny you say that. I'm holding it right now, obviously. I like its size. I like the dimensions of it, if that makes sense for a book. It's not like it's square. It's still book-shaped, but there's something about the size from an actual object perspective I really enjoy.
Likewise, when the first actual copies showed up on my doorstep, I was just so excited to hold it, the feel of it. It's thick still, but small. You can put it in your back pocket if you're lucky enough to have pockets in your clothing.
Absolutely. We should tell people Journey to the Imaginal Realm. So what is it about, this lovely book I'm holding?
This book is a reader's guide to Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, and it came out of a course that I taught last year. I'm actually teaching again this year as well for NeuroLearning, which is an online learning platform started by Jeremy Johnson. And as I was teaching that course last fall, I was writing out the lectures and pouring everything that I'd been wanting to say about The Lord of the Rings for almost 2 decades into it. And near the end of the course, I realized, my goodness, this is about the size of a book. And so I shared that on on social media and was offered by Jeremy Johnson and Jen Zart of Revelor Press. Would we like to publish it and turn it into a book? So it really is a kind of step-by-step guide through Tolkien's Lord of the Rings.
And I did that course, which was my last summer, right? Because different hemispheres. And I've read the book, and it definitely came out of the course, but it's also, I said this to my little brother because he's getting a copy for Christmas. It's also different. Like if you've done the course, you should I learned stuff from the book that I either zoned out during the course. And it's funny, it showed up just in time for Christmas. And whilst I read the book last summer, again, hemispheres, this summer I'm going to, and it's based on what I learned from the book, and you probably did mention this in the course. I was distracted with things like crazy fires and so on. But I'm going to have the audiobook read to me over the summer. That's how I'm going to do it. So I'm going to go through the chapters of this book whilst using the audible version of Lord of the Rings, because I've just finished up doing going through, which I've read a bunch of times, same as Lord of the Rings, of course, the Earthsea books. And I just listened to all of them on Audible on holiday. And it was a very, very different and really enriching experience. So I have never had Lord of the Rings come through my ears. And that's what I'm going to do this summer with your book.
That sounds like such a wonderful way to do it. I've never done that myself with the Lord of the Rings. I haven't been as drawn to audiobooks, but lately, I think actually in part coming out of that course that I taught, I've really enjoyed reading and being able to speak the words that I write. So I almost feel like I'm coming to an appreciation of audiobooks from the other side as the performer of them.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I've been an Audible member for years, but it's usually nonfiction for me because I started figuring, oh, cool. This is when I'm still in London. Oh, cool. I can get through novels on my commute, but I kept falling asleep or mind wandering. So I tend to use it more for nonfiction and lecture series and so on, because in a weird way, you can kind of dip in and out and still learn some stuff. So it's kind of like an upskilling thing. I don't know. And I returned to using it for novels with Ursula Le Guin's books, and it was transformative. I'm in a different context now, so I'm sort of, driving around this bucolic green valley, which suits, I think, being told fantasy stories as you're driving. But nevertheless, like I would even potentially suggest that something that is, I would say, start with Le Guin and build up to Tolkien. That would be the next step. If you're looking for something to an audiobook in that world, it's almost like, I mean, obviously they go well together for a bunch of different reasons, but there's something differently lyrical about the Earthsea books that I found good training for. I think I found good training for novels because I've listened to a couple of other ones since then. Anyway, that's my take on it.
I will take you up on that. I really like that idea, beginning with Earthsea. It's been a long time since I read those books, and I've been wanting to revisit them. And there's something so immersive about the audio.
Absolutely. And I will say, and I know for people who are, because there's quite a few Audible fans out there, and I know some people who listen have listened through the Audible available HarperCollins Lord of the Rings books. And there's some controversy around the performance of the narrator. I don't have a problem with it, but I will tell you that all 4 of the first 4 Earthsea books, different narrators, all excellent. So I think that might be part of it. But yeah, please do. I'd love to. We'll chat about it via email. But if that's where you begin with your Audible novel stuff, because you know what, for you, Becca, Lord of the Rings, whilst it is amazing, if you're listening to it, it's surely got to feel like work at some point.
That's an interesting proposition, because it's, I'm one of those people who's really blessed to be doing work that is connected to the things that I love, Tolkien and the imagination and astrology and so forth. And it is interesting when some things cross that line from being pleasure to being work. Reading The Lord of the Rings never has crossed that line. And talking about Tolkien has never crossed that line. And I'm infinitely grateful for that, because I wouldn't want to lose that. And I think that actually speaks to the endurance of what Tolkien has written and created, that no matter how many times you go back to it, it doesn't become a task to make your way through it. At least that's my experience of it.
Very true. I think it's almost the opposite. It's almost a respite from the world, which, funnily enough, before we hit the record button, is the discussion I want to have for this episode. We are towards the end of the year, and this will, I think, will be the last show that comes out in November. So we're literally the last month of the year when most people will be listening to this. And just kind of looking at 2020, you mentioned astrology. And so even if you aren't, and I don't know why you wouldn't, because it's fun, but even if you aren't operating to some sort of semi-predictive cycle models like astrology, something that gives you a lyrical and interpretive understanding of time, 2020 is going to be a challenge. That's there in the space weather. That's there in any of the models you look at. And even if you don't use them, it's going to be a really horrible, another endless presidential election. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on wherever you look in the world. And it seems to me that I think if we look at Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, there is stuff in there that we can use for guidance and fortification or enrichment heading into challenging times. The book, Lord of the Rings itself, but also generally his work, emerges from the context, as all books do, of his life. And so there are endless stories about, endless exploration of the existence of evil and what suffering means and why it's in the world and all this kind of stuff. And that, I think that's potentially useful. I don't know. What do you think?
I couldn't agree more. And the time that we're in now, and that's really going to be peaking next year in 2020, it's the same archetypal zeitgeist that was in the world when the First World War was unfolding, which Tolkien fought in, or the Second World War was unfolding during the years that he was writing The Lord of the Rings. And just to speak astrologically, there's an alignment of Saturn and Pluto that has been in the sky since 2018, but it's making its first exact alignment in January of 2020. And that is the same configuration of planets, Saturn with Pluto, as was in the sky with both world wars, as well as numerous other geopolitical conflicts over the centuries. I mean, we can just look at the last century and what is lined up with Saturn Pluto, such as the Vietnam War or 9/11 and so forth. And I think we're all feeling that weighty, heavy, challenging, and divisive energy in the collective right now. And Tolkien is someone who was able to look very directly at that kind of darkness and to see, what the tasks are that we can take on as individuals and as communities in facing those intense challenges. And Tolkien himself is born with a Saturn-Pluto alignment in his natal chart. So he is a perfect person to actually give voice to this, of what is our own calling in these times. To share a quote that is arguably my favorite out of The Lord of the Rings that I repeat all the time whenever I can. It's that wonderful quote from Gandalf when he says to Frodo, who's wishing that the ring hadn't been found in his time and that this task wasn't set before him. And Gandalf says, so do all who come to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. And I think that that's maybe the most apt quote that we could be drawing on for our current moment, is how are we going to spend this time that is in front of us right now?
You said a couple of things there, well, all of it, but a couple of things there that I really enjoyed. I didn't realize there was a Saturn-Pluto configuration in Tolkien's chart, which does make him the sort of very useful mind for where we're heading. That was one of them. But I think it was when you said he had the capacity to look at it, to have the capacity to look at challenge and suffering, because it's sort of overplayed. Not that it isn't there, and this emerged in your book, definitely. It's overplayed, and it may be an artifact of the films, that his experience at the Somme is in the books. And that's true. But actually, he was kind of like an avatar for experiencing suffering from the very beginning, like losing his father early and being forbidden, finding the woman of his dreams and then being forbidden to see her for 6 years when they both met effectively in like a boarding house for orphans, losing friends young and then obviously losing most of them in the war. Like, his life wasn't fun, right? Like, there were some really bad things from the very beginning. So to have a mind like that and we're going to get into it with like the Ainu Lindale and so on. To have a mind like that experience suffering and experience it quite a lot. It's not just the sum, is it? Like this guy went through some stuff.
He really did. I mean, you named so many of them. Probably one of the most pivotal was the loss of his mother when he was 12. That was really maybe the most shattering. And also the loss that solidified his faith. His mother had converted to Roman Catholicism in 1900 when Tolkien was 8 years old. And because of that decision, she's in England, part of an Anglican family. Everyone was Anglican, and she was rejected by her family for that decision. And when she fell ill with diabetes, there was no one to take care of her emotionally, financially, and so forth. And that really drove her to an early grave. And so Tolkien said he saw her as a martyr to her faith. And I think that really points to something about Tolkien, that all of these losses that he experienced, both parents, all of his close friends, except one in the First World War, that separation from Edith until his 21st birthday in 1913, he was able to take suffering and through faith, and I would say through imagination, turn it into beauty. And that's an extraordinary gift. Stephen Colbert was interviewed several months ago about his great love of Tolkien, and what he said, probably the most meaningful thing he learned from Tolkien, was how to handle loss. And that is such a tremendous gift that we've received from Tolkien as a way to handle loss with grace and with beauty, and to see even the greater wonder within it.
Yeah, and that's perfectly described, his capacity to use faith and imagination and turn it into beauty, right? Because that hits the sort of two key topic areas I think we want to explore this time. And the first one is, I guess, imagination, but in particular on fairy stories, and then the Ainu Lindale, because in a funny way, not really that funny, if we're turning to Tolkien now, decades after his death, for assistance in getting through 2020, these two things hang together in an interesting way. And so what would be useful, I think, is to situate the actual initial, almost like lecture, when it was initially a lecture, on fairy stories in his life. And I've got a few comments that I sort of pulled out of the introduction to the Flieger Anderson copy of On Fairy Story. But for people who are unaware of the talk he gave, and we'll hand over to you in a second, in between The Hobbit coming out and The Lord of the Rings coming out, because there was definitely a gap there. And it seems to me, and correct me or add way more detail to this, this is the leveling up, right? So what the Flieger Anderson introduction goes through is some of the places in The Hobbit where he almost he doesn't take imagination and the elves and things as seriously. He's not sure how to handle them. He does it kind of in a couple of places, that Pixar movie thing where he's almost talking to the adults in the room in his children's story, rather than actually just, which is what On Fairy Stories is about, rather than actually standing in and exploring and standing for this act of subcreation. And also his elves are kind of a bit gimmicky. And so it's almost like he had to come to a realization of what fairy is and what the imagination is, and to actually back it and to sort of be a little bit less squeamish than he was with The Hobbit. And in the introduction to the Flieger Anderson version of this book, if people want to go get it, because it is an essay, but you want the Flieger Anderson one. It was the process of putting together this lecture that kind of firmed up in his own mind his ideas of what the imaginal and the imagination and so on is. And without that, The Lord of the Rings wouldn't be what it was. Is that fair? What else do we need to tell people about On Fairy Stories at this point?
That's a great introduction of it. And it did begin as a lecture. He delivered it in 1939, so 2 years after The Hobbit was published and after he'd started writing The Lord of the Rings, but definitely it wasn't well underway. And he revised the lecture a few times into the final version of the essay that we have. And I want to echo your recommendation of the Flieger-Anderson version, because that is the only version that not only has excellent commentary in it from the editor, but it also has multiple manuscript drafts and a very tantalizing handwritten page of notes that even has Jung's name jotted down twice, along with the phrase, something that I think can be deciphered as saying psychology of the unconscious, or close enough to that. And it's an essay where he really is wrestling with what is fairy story? What is its purpose? What is fantasy? What is the imagination? What does the creative process look like? And I have read this essay, particularly the section titled Fantasy. That's probably the core of the essay, more times than I can count. And every single time, especially in that section on fantasy, I have to stop and ask myself, what's he really saying? Well, he's contradicting himself here. He's contradicting himself there. He's so frustratingly and deliciously, delightfully ambiguous, which just perfectly fits a man in the middle of the 20th century, the modern disenchanted era, wrestling with what is fairy? What is the imagination? What is fairy and drama? While he doesn't use these terms, what is visionary experience? Those seem to be the core issues at the heart of that originally lecture and then essay that do indeed, as you're saying, go on to shape and inform the execution of The Lord of the Rings and its final achievement.
So you've read it a bunch of times. I did mention this before we hit record. And how much of it do you think is him? And I think it's a bit of both, but no one really talks about the second bit. How much of it do you think is him wrestling with these notions internally, as you just described, like him forming his own opinions on what the imagination and fantasy and so on is? And how much of it do you think is him? There's just a few moments in it. I did the reread in preparation for this recording. There's a few moments in it where he's softballing things, and I'm just wondering if it's because, I mean, the dodgiest thing about him was that he was Catholic in early to mid 20th century England, right? But otherwise, it's establishment stuff. He's married. He works. He's at Oxford. There are certain things. This is an establishment figure, and so and he does when he gives lectures and so, and it's in an establishment setting. It's not Timothy Leary. And so how much of it do you think is him throughout his life, but also maybe somewhere there in the kind of finalized versions of Unfairy Stories? Do you think he didn't tell his whole truth with this stuff? This is a personal thing. I know usually when we get you on the show, because you know all this stuff inside out, we do look for textual evidence to back up statements we're going to make about Tolkien. But it's more like you do this, Becca. This is the life's work. How much do you think he might have left out about the imaginal and fantasy and how real elves are and all that kind of stuff?
Oh, get to hear what I really think. I feel like he left it out of plain language most of the time. And that is why he's so ambiguous in the essays, often in the letters. But there's something within that. And part of me thinks that maybe it's because he's simply concealing it, feeling like what he's trying to say simply wouldn't be understood. The way he describes fairy as something that is really indescribable. But you have to try and give language to it. And if anyone could give language to it, it must be a philologist, a lover of language, someone who could see language from the inside like he could. So I do think he's really pointing toward something enchanted that he encountered. And I would say probably kept encountering in different ways. And all the writing that he left behind really does point toward that. I mean, where do these stories come from? He's writing about elves and Middle Earth and the Blessed Realm for decades. And not only is he writing about it for decades, but there are certain core images that just persist from 1913, 14, 15 onward. Some even earlier, 1911, 12, where he's either written it for the first time in a poetic line or drawn it in the Book of Ishnis. And he stays true to those images for decades. And if you hold all of that up to notion of something like fiction being simply made up, where someone sits down, they have an idea and they work it out in a way that is kind of logical. And so it doesn't really add up. Why would these core images be so essential? And that's where I do feel like everything is at least pointing toward him having some very profound experiences. And I actually think more evidence comes not from Tolkien's own writing on the matter, but how other people respond.
Absolutely. Jumping ahead in the conversation, like if you're looking for, there's a thing we can do which he can't, because I do think, and it's weird to say, he actually mentions it in the lecture, in which, for people who haven't got the book yet, the Flieger Anderson book, it's the Andrew Lang Memorial Lecture, who was published in the 19th century philologist, folklorist, comparativist. Because and what he said was just what you said there. Like, I think Tolkien struggled with where ideas come from, because it's funny, the bit that I reread, because it sort of pertains to starships, is he says that the history of fairy stories is more complex than the history of the human race, and that people who do philology and comparison and all that kind of stuff that started with the late 18th, early 19th century realization that languages were related to each other, and so they start to kind of family tree together all these folklore motifs and so on, which is something I'm generally pro, as long as you don't do it in an imperial context. But he sort of uses the metaphor of the quarry, which is like, you can't, and it's a very Rupert Sheldrake thing to say, which is like, that's cool, but you're not going to learn anything about what's inside a story by quarrying it, by using it as a mine. It reminded me of what Sheldrake said about, you won't learn about software by putting a laptop in a blender. And that's kind of what Tolkien's saying, like, this is all well and good that we can say that these folklore motifs come from somewhere over here and whatever. And I think that's why I want to talk and sort of center on fairy stories for this discussion, is that it's a galaxy brain moment for him to situate what he does as a job and his fiction in this. And he has, and correctly so, choice words for the like Yang hypothesis and whatever, which is a bit of a boss move at a memorial lecture, to sort of wail on on the guy that they're memorializing.
Yep.
But you have like a galaxy brain moment where the production of fiction, I'm using air quotes, the creation of fiction, he manages to situate in this current of stories and language that goes back to the beginning of time. And that's a real galaxy brain thing that happens on fairy stories that informs Lord of the Rings, but it's also why it's in this episode, because that centers and I think gives fiction, again using air quotes, back its power to be something you can bring with you into 2020, so that it is a legitimate source of inspiration and guidance and succor and protection and all the things that I kind of want for this episode heading into 2020, particularly with Lord of the Rings. There's this moment for me at the beginning of the lecture where he uses the quarry metaphor and says that the history of fairy stories is probably more complex than the history of the human race. And because it's Rune Soup, if you double down on that and assert a fixed ontological status for fairies themselves, then he basically he described starships in half a sentence. And that for me is why I think it's so useful. Here's the guy galaxy braining the creation of fiction and then goes on to create this thing that, as you say, the evidence for its some kind of reality is that everyone goes to the same place and everyone has some kind of impact from it.
I think that if we look at when Tolkien is writing this too, when he's delivering the lecture and he's revising the essay, these are the years 1939 to 44 approximately. And these are the years when the Inklings were meeting most frequently, when they were really having their deep conversations and sharing ideas. And even though Tolkien doesn't speak about Owen Barfield as much as I personally think he should, he had read Barfield's Poetic Diction, which came out in 1928, and was taking in these ideas that Barfield was articulating, coming from his background connected to Rudolf Steiner and so forth, around an evolution of consciousness. And that perspective, when applied to philology and folklore and so on, is one that actually allows you to enter into a sympathetic imagination with earlier eras. And that, I think, is part of what is giving Tolkien the ability to look at, say, Beowulf and say, let's not quarry it. Let's not just pick it apart for the stones, but let's see it from the inside. And by the inside, he means let's enter into the consciousness of the person who wrote that. And it's not a modern consciousness. And that was the, I think, maybe error, or I don't want to go so far as to say error, the misperception that he's attempting to correct from the late 19th century philologists and folklorists who are looking back on fairy tales and on language and myth and so forth, and seeing it more as something that, like modern consciousness, but just naive.
Yeah.
Rather than a kind of consciousness that is participating in its world in a way that consciousness can see things the modern consciousness no longer can. Modern consciousness can see other things. Something is gained when something else is lost. But I think that on fairy stories, and also Tolkien's Beowulf essay, his ideas at this time were being informed by the Inklings and certainly by Barfield.
Yeah, we've had Gary Luckman on the show a couple of times talking about it, and you see the Barfield thing in a lot of the creation myth, where essentially language started symbolic and declined rather than started with ug, meaning rock, and complexifying. And you kind of see him realizing that that's not the case when he's, and rightly so, kind of saying that the idea that fairy stories are either childlike and naive, or the other prevailing materialist idea was that they are simple minds describing meteorological phenomena. And he's like, no, it's neither of them. It's a bit both, but it's also neither of them. It's this other thing. And that it's funny. Like one of the things that's in the show notes for people listening, you recently gave a co-presentation about Tolkien's creation myths and Hildegard of Bingen with Jake Sherman, and that's in the show notes for people. And I have to say, before I get to my point, it is like the best overview in 10 minutes of Tolkien's creation account ever. So if you're listening to this and you've sort of struggled with the Silmarillion, for instance, and sort of abandoned it halfway, get to the video and have Becca basically talk you through the Ainur Lindale in like 10 minutes, and you go, oh, I totally get it now. But it's interesting, coming back to the point that it's an act of co-creation from the beginning that is better. It's so that you have kind of higher beings singing and co-creating, and there's something about that that's very Barfieldian, right? And as well as being Gnostic and so on. But like, before we get to it, this is the sort of weird handover point between On Fairy Stories and his notion of creation, because it's there in both of them. When he talks about image creation, but I think people miss what he meant by image. When we talk about image and imagination and then subcreation, image, he means it as far as I can tell, he means it in a Platonic way or a Platonic-ish way, that gives it a kind of that gives it a reality that we gloss over if we don't realize. We think image like Instagram. No, image is something baked into the universe, and so he's really getting properly. He's saying something about his philosophy when he talks about image, isn't he?
I agree with you there that it is a tapping into a kind of Platonic archetypal form when he says image, and that imagination as the faculty of image making, which he doesn't really go into as much as you would want him to in that essay. And these are the paragraphs that I've just gleaned over and over, because there's this feeling when you read them that you're taking an exact means and then realizing that you've missed the inverse meaning that he also means. That imagination is the faculty of image making. And so at first your mind might go, oh, well, yes, it's the faculty of making up the image. But that's not what he means.
That's not what he meant. It's
exactly
as hermetic as the day is long. And he just kind of says,
yes.
And that's what I mean by sometimes he softballs it. And I think it's because this good Catholic boy can't say what he actually thinks is going on. And for me, the key is in image making. Like that is a godlike power straight out of Hermeticism. And we just go, oh, image making and subcreation. But I think that's the key to him realizing whatever the hell is going on with his life and these languages that show up and all the rest of it is cosmic.
I would say that Tolkien does almost nothing by accident. And on fairy stories, it's worth making note what he capitalizes. He capitalizes imagination. He capitalizes subcreation. He capitalizes fantasy, enchantment, and so on. And every time he does that, I think he's pointing toward that these are archetypal qualities. They're not what we mean by the same words when we use a lowercase letter to start them. And when he speaks of imagination with a capital I, he is pointing toward that which brings forth the images. And the next stage of subcreation, that's the art of shaping it into a coherent story, something that has that inner consistency of reality, so that you can read The Lord of the Rings all the way through and it makes sense from beginning to end. It's not disconnected vignettes like, say, the Book of Lost Tales is, which is what he was doing decades earlier. They don't have the inner consistency of reality yet. It's more in the realm of just imagination, the image arising, but he hasn't yet worked out the art of a true subcreation. And actually, back to your original point around on fairy stories, I would say on fairy stories is maybe that pivot moment after The Hobbit is completed and before The Lord of the Rings has been fully written, that he figures out, oh, this is how I make it consistent. And that's where he's figured out the art, which is the second, was the subcreative process.
Which we should go into in a little bit more detail first, but why I've got these things hanging together in my head, and you can tell me if I'm overstating it or if there's any use to it. Because my goal is, we get his idea of creation, as in the act of creating, and also the song or songs of creation that's in Middle Earth. But it seems to me that once he kind of firms up what he means by creation and subcreation on fairy stories, it is useful to look at how the act of creation is essentially creation and subcreation in the Ainu Lindale as well. So it's almost like I'm giving you theory, and actually here is the same, I'm saying the same thing, but I'm saying it within a subcreation. And it just seems like, am I taking that too far?
I don't think you're taking it too far. It's actually a very Platonic move on his part. Mm-hmm. Plato will put forward, or through the dialogues with Socrates and others, Plato will put forward the theory, the idea, even arguing against something like myth, and then he ends his greatest dialogues in myth, the myth of Ur, or Timaeus's myth of the world soul, for example. So in a way, we can kind of look at Tolkien in that sense also, that there is the theory on fairy stories. Let's see it as the myth, which he wrote long before. He wrote the music of the Ainur, his cosmogony, in 1919. And then he did revise it, but so much stays the same. There are some changes and tweaks that give it less of a kind of Manichaean Gnostic duality that the original has. But overall, the structure is remarkably the same in his multiple versions of this creation myth, where you have the one god, Iluvatar, and then the emanation of his thought, the Ainur, and then the Ainur sing the world into being. And then the discord of Melkor is sung in. And then there are these different stages where when the music ceases, it is shown to them as a vision. And from the vision, it is brought into being when Iluvatar says, Ea, let these things be. And then finally, it is the task of the Ainur who choose to take on this work, to enter into the world itself and build it from their memory of the vision, and most importantly, from their memory of the music that they all sang and co-created together. So there's all these stages in this creation myth that are echoing many different creation stories of the primordial tradition. And as you brought up this co-presentation that Jacob Sherman and I did, I heard von Bingen's visionary experiences that very much were still within the Catholic Church, Catholic dogma. They were accepted within that worldview in her time in the 12th century. So Tolkien is bringing forward in some ways a unique myth, but it's also a myth that's rooted in numerous other creation stories and cosmogonies, and it's an expression of his philosophy of imagination. It really is an extraordinary beginning to the world that he articulates.
It's fascinating. One of the things I hadn't noticed until maybe semi-recently, the last couple of years, is, and we'll go through it in a little bit, because I think in the Ainur Lindale, again, you give a great rundown of it in the video for people listening to this. There is a very good explanation for the existence of the discordant, of suffering and so on, which is sort of Melkor's contribution to the co-creation with the creator god and the Ainur, which I like. And it is kind of, it's interesting because it's almost a high medieval understanding of how the devil exists, because it's that the devil is still, by virtue of being the devil, fulfilling God's plan or will for creation. And Iluvatar says something similar about the stuff that Melkor isn't the source of the sort of discord, but it ultimately comes from him and flows through him. So it sort of situates suffering as originating with God, but for like a very specific purpose in creation, if you want to pick it up from there.
Yes, it begins with Melkor, who is kind of like this Lucifer figure, bringing in themes that are not the same as the theme that Iluvatar, the one god, has propounded the other Ainur to adorn with their own themes. So Iluvatar presents the theme and then invites the other Ainur to sing it and to adorn it with their own thought and creation, their own creativity. That's really an illustration of what subcreation is, that the uttermost source comes from the divine, but then it's for each sub-creator to shape it, to bring the art to it as they will. But what brings in the discord is that Melkor chooses not to bring his own creativity to bear on the theme that has been presented. He brings his own theme. And that theme is inspired by his wanderings alone in the darkness of the void. And there is some difference in how Tolkien wrote this in 1919 and how he later revised it in the version that's published in the Silmarillion. Because in the first version, it says that this darkness, the void, is where Iluvatar had not yet turned the light of his face. And that the theme that Melkor brings in is at odds with Iluvatar's theme. So there's more of a tension between the two. Whereas in the later revisions, Tolkien kind of softened that to say not that the discord was with Iluvatar's theme, but rather with the thoughts of his brethren, with the other Ainur. So you can see that slight difference in the original, where it's actually a clash of two musics. And in the softened revision, you still have that clash of two musics, but it's more at the level of the sub-creators rather than at the level of sub-creator with God. Now, whether those feel reconcilable to one, I think would take, diving into both versions very deeply and seeing, how does it really work out in the later revision. Personally, I think both versions are absolutely remarkable and have more in common, as I was saying before, than a difference. But discord that Melkor brings in, as Iluvatar says, I believe in both versions, he says that it has its uttermost source in him. The discord ultimately stems from the one God, or at least he takes responsibility for it. And what he says is that discord will create more beauty and wonder than if it had never existed. And that's really where I think that this idea of the beauty of suffering that Tolkien speaks to is so apparent, that it's in the disharmony, the harm, the evil acts even, that there is this space for redemption or a higher glory. And that's too where you can see, of course, his Christianity shining through in its really beautiful mystical form as well.
It's we'll get to the sort of obligation for co-creation or co-singing towards the end of the show, but also the story. But one of the things that really fascinated me on this reread and kind of putting together is it starts quite platonic, Gnostic platonic, and it doesn't end there. So in the slight majority, if not just majority, of tellings of the Dreamtime in Aboriginal cultures, the original beings from the Dreamtime that shape the universe and the land, then essentially, because they don't really go anywhere, but they essentially enter creation and become the mountains, so that there's or the river, or the beach, or the forest, or whatever. So they actually sing and perform the universe into existence, and then become the thing that they brought into existence. They don't go anywhere. They literally, essentially, like go down to sleep as a mountain. It's super interesting that that's basically, which he wouldn't have known, because that definitely, actually might have. There were some accounts in the early 20th century, but not that many, and not very good ones, which he wouldn't have known that. And it's kind of interesting to me that it kind of starts Platonic and almost ends animist, because the obligation for co-creation or co-singing with the sort of two child races of Iluvatar, so, us and the elves, really, really matches some kind of like ayahuasca experiences I had in the jungle earlier this year, where humans were, it felt at the time like it was a requirement to be co-creating the universe. And it was in a musical context, because it was Icarus and singing, and we're there in the jungle and it's all lit up and so on. And it was a very, very Tolkien-esque moment. And I just find that fascinating, that it's almost, he might have accidentally, for my own satisfaction, found the solve between the parts of Platonism that I like, because I don't generally like much of it, and the much more embodied stuff that I do like, because the Ainur become the things that they sing, don't they?
They do. The Ainur who choose to enter into the world, they become the Valar, the powers of the world. And while they don't maybe necessarily settle as, one mountain or
Yeah.
one great tree, they do shift between these forms, and they are of the world and the world is of them. And in a certain way, elves are that way too. They're also bound to the world. Their life is part of it. Whereas human beings, we are the ones who are different. We're the strangers, we're the guests, we're the ones who seek beyond the world and have the freedom to shape our destiny beyond the music, beyond fate. But that also means that we are fated or doomed or gifted the capacity to die out of the world. Whereas the elves and the Valar, the powers of the world, are bound to it as long as it will last. So it's a very different relationship to the world, being completely embedded within it for its whole existence, and then having this human capacity to die out of the world, to die beyond the world, and that there is this seeking for the beyond, even at the same time as there is this deep, almost tragic love of the world. And yeah.
The freedom is also the freedom not to do it. This is the bit that you'll find in some shamanic cultures, that what sets, and I'm using that word broadly, obviously, what sets humans apart from everything else in creation is our capacity to not fulfill our will or our function. So like a shark can't become an accountant. A shark is a shark and it can't not be a shark. Whereas we have, it's that standing apart or being in and out of the world as part of the function and the obligation to co-create, but you have to kind of be in it. And it's really interesting that we get given that Iluvatar gift, right? That it's described in his kind of Christian notions of, because he's playing with free will and fate. Like it's described in that notion, but I can situate the same, or I can find a very similar idea in an embedded or animist context, that it's humans that are the only ones who can be something other than humans, which is good, but it's also bad because hello environment. It's fascinating.
That reminds me of the great Renaissance manifesto that was written by Pico della Mirandola. He was 23 years old, and he wrote the Oration on the Dignity of Man, or we would say the dignity of the human being. And that when God was creating all of the animals and plants, each one of them had their own archetype. And then when it came to human beings, there was no single archetype assigned to human beings, but rather the possibility to fall lower than the demons or to rise higher than the angels. And I feel like that speaks to Tolkien's articulation of the human potential as well. We can choose not to act in harmony with the music, with the world. And in that way, we are most like Melkor, that we can bring discord. But we also have the free choice to act in greater harmony or to further the beauty of creation in some way. And that choice really does lie before us. And it's just to go back to what you were saying earlier about almost beginning with Plato and ending with Anne. I think maybe the teacher I had of Plato, who's Jacob Sherman, who I'm doing that presentation with, he has a very participatory reading of Plato's philosophy and understanding of the way the archetypes or the ideal forms, actually we participate in them, and that they're not necessarily utterly at a remove from us. And so I think because of how I've learned Plato through his very sympathetic reading and talking about sweeping away the reception history of Plato over the last 2,000 years, and rather entering into that sympathetic imagination with him and seeing, well, what would the world have looked like to Plato's consciousness? And in some ways, I don't want to stretch my reading of Plato too far, we do end up in that kind of animist world that you're describing.
Jake Stratton Kent, in coming at it from a magical perspective, calls it low Platonism, because it's one of those. I like that reception of the text idea, because if you do put that aside, two things. It's not immediately obvious how much of Plato's thought comes from Plato and how much of it was him giving his read on stuff that was in the air, right? Because if you look at the actual magical objects that tumble out of a worldview and not necessarily or not exclusively from an educated context, like these rich city boys, you see that what you were just talking about. You see there is what Jake calls low Platonism, is there is a participatory way of understanding your relationship to Platonic forms that is not as antiseptic as we've got through the, as you say, like the reception of the texts.
Yes, absolutely. I think part of why I'm bringing this up too is that I've had experiences, you brought up ayahuasca, and in non-ordinary states of consciousness or working with sacred medicine, I've had experiences of looking at the world, and when you see the beauty in the world and you just recognize, oh, that's beauty with a capital B. That's the archetypal beauty. I just realized, at the end of the day, no matter where I journey philosophically, at the end of the day, I do think I am a Platonist, but it's a Platonist in the 21st century.
Yeah, I go as far as essentialist, but animist essentialist, but it's the same thing. Weirdly, when I went on Dieta this year, because I'm always reading animist books, and I had this thought, I'm like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take Neoplatonic books into the jungle, and everyone else brought animist books. Most of them guests from my show, which was amazing. But I'm like, no, I'm going to do the opposite, because I don't read that much Neoplatonic stuff. So I did. And and it was weird. My experience of it on the off days and kind of coming down, reading this Neoplatonic text, or a sort of a history of it and description of it, was that it was over-defined and over-described, but over-describing some kind of underlying reality which I was experiencing. So I like this kind of looser, low Platonism idea. I think that's in there, and you just need to sort of squint at the Platonic texts rather than take it as an exact description of reality. And the Neoplatonists actually, yes, took it too far in that kind of direction that's not there. And I think the archaeological evidence is the best way of kind of earthing. Look at us, earthing Plato's actual insight. Like, I fucking know what Plato was actually talking about, but you know what I mean? Like earthing it or situating it back where it's bioavailable rather than just available through a text.
The lived Platonism.
Yeah.
And I think, the fact that Plato is writing dialogues and not straight treatises on his thought speaks volumes to the ambiguity and the room for other thought, and why we are talking about Plato 2,000 years later, more than years later, because there's space still to breathe new life into what he's saying. And how do we live Platonism today? And I find it remarkably applicable still.
Well, so this is a really good opportunity to pivot into that final part, because, and I think we've nailed it, to be quite honest. Yay us. What I wanted to do in order to put enough juice or fire behind not just Lord of the Rings, but fantasy and so on. I want to kind of marshal the things we can take and why we should take this seriously and what it can offer for 2020. And I'll bring it back to, I think point one is that a Tolkien-esque perspective and reading Lord of the Rings with awareness is principally a fight against disenchantment, which I think is going to be very useful, even astrologically, next year. And for that, you said you've read the What is Fantasy a bunch of times. You mentioned that at the top of the show. What is your definition of fantasy, Becca, rather than Tolkien's?
My definition of fantasy, I usually use it to refer to, I guess, something along the line of what Jung meant by active imagination, or the product of it. Fantasy being the images, or especially the scenes, that arise within us through contemplative practice or through non-ordinary states of consciousness, but even to a certain degree, say through dream, although dreams are dreams, fantasies have more of an active component to them. So I tend to see fantasy more as a noun when I use that term, but it is multifaceted. And of course, my perspective has been informed by what everyone else has to say on it, as happens to you when you go through graduate school. So fantasy also, I guess, could be a way of seeing the world. And I think this is maybe can be brought to bear on that question of reading The Lord of the Rings now and turning in toward 2020, is that when you read a fantasy like The Lord of the Rings, you enter into that world. In some ways, you enter into that fantasy, those naturally arising images. But then when you turn back outward, when you set down the book and you look at the world around you, those images stay with you, and they actually re-enchant the world in the sense that they alter your way of seeing the world. They alter your imaginative engagement with the world, and it makes possible different ways of showing up in relationship, in community, in terms of one's work, in terms of facing the really hard problems that we have before us, such as ecological collapse and climate catastrophe and mass extinction and so forth, that if you view those things through a lens that has been shaped by fantasy, then you have a possibility of actually viewing those not as problems, but as a task to take on, something to be faced in a way that we're already seeing being shouldered by the figures in The Lord of the Rings, for example.
That teed up perfectly the next point, which is, it kind of comes back to what you were saying about The Lord of the Rings being an enduring and profound meditation on the existence of suffering and what to do about it. So I've redescribed that as a rallying call against despair. And it seems to me things coming at us in 2020 are disenchantment and despair, amongst other stuff. And what you just said there, right? Like, to view from within fantasy correctly described, and not as something not as a hallucination, but as fantasy correctly described, leaves the door open that it's not, that failure isn't a foregone conclusion, that actually you can end up with some kind of, happy ending's the wrong word, but that evil doesn't triumph.
Catastrophe.
Yeah, evil doesn't triumph. And there are things, and that, for me, why I keep coming back to The Lord of the Rings is that rallying call against despair, because stuff's really bad. And it's not, and it's almost like the trick is to just insist that is not the case. Do you know what I mean? It's always like the counter spell is to say, no, as a matter of fact, the world isn't ending, there's somewhere in that I think you can learn from The Lord of the Rings, which is like the right attitude to insurmountable odds, perhaps.
And it's a saying no, not in the sense of denial of the state of the world. I think maybe we have to be careful there.
Yes, that's yeah.
but not despairing in the sense that we don't know how it'll turn out. And that even, you brought up failure, even failure may be necessary for that happy ending, or as Tolkien calls it, the eucatastrophe, to jump to that truly pivotal moment. And for anybody who hasn't read The Lord of the Rings, stop listening to me right now. For that pivotal moment when Frodo is unable to throw the ring into the fire, into Mount Doom, he has seemingly failed. He claims it for himself, but it's only that failure that makes the ultimate success of the quest possible. Because I don't think he could have been overcome by Gollum in that moment if he hadn't failed, if he hadn't claimed the ring for himself, because he loses that position of moral and spiritual superiority over Gollum that he had even minutes earlier when he can fight him off. But when Frodo himself has failed as an individual, he fully sacrifices himself, including all of him that he thought was good, on behalf of the larger quest. And it's only through that that the quest can be achieved. And there's this extraordinary reversal of fortune. But the eucatastrophe, the happy ending, it contains the word catastrophe. It really isn't possible without the catastrophe, without the failure first. That's why it takes your breath away. That's why you're left in wonder, because it isn't simply, oh, things worked out. It's everything actually had to fail in order for a greater success to happen.
It's paranormal. It's creepy. So people want to put, and it's fine if they do, people want to put God in at points like that, which is, a different way of saying the conclusion is not foregone is to say it's ultimately up to God, right? And so you can say that you can describe the final events of the just before the destruction of the ring in that way, but it's almost creepier in a paranormal sense of it has to happen that way because that's how it has to happen because we were here for that to happen. And it's just this really strange synchronicitous thought, which is deeply profound. Like there is a magical universe for you right there.
And I think that speaks to more of a broader understanding of divinity, for example, and not so much God as a deus ex machina, as just this intervention when things are going wrong. It's more of the entire world orchestrates to make possible the greater achievement. And that in itself is the presence of the divine, not as some external influence, but actually the synthesis and coming together of every person, the whole physical world, spiritual world, imaginal world in one moment in order for the next moment to be achieved.
Well, I hope everyone's listening because that's another Lord of the Rings bomb for you for 2020. Because honestly, we're going to need that kind of stuff. And the final one, I think, which we've spoken quite a bit about, is how to say this? I guess an obligation for artistic expression, or more that to express oneself creatively comes with a moral option. So are you going to debase or are you going to enrich the world with your output? And I think that is, like, for me anyway, the final piece of looking at the stuff we've discussed heading into 2020. And it is as simple as, and I try to do this myself, but it is as simple as be careful what toxicity you bring to people's social feeds, for instance, because you have the choice to not do that. and that extends all the way up to if you are a painter or a novelist or what have you, the world somehow, and Tolkien's done more work on this than we did, somehow the act of creation by a human is implicated in divine creation. Somehow. I think that's a fair statement. And so take that really seriously heading into 2020. What are your thoughts?
I feel that when there are definitions made of people as artists, and therefore that implies other people are not artists, we're doing humanity a disservice. Because, as you're saying, that idea that our creativity maybe comes from a divine creativity, if you put it in kind of a Christian language, that would be, we are made in the image of God, and if God is a maker, then we therefore are makers as well. But you can read that in numerous other theological or spiritual contexts. And the capacity to turn life experience into artistic expression, or rather simply to live artfully, can be one of the most profoundly healing, transformative, and meaning making. And I mean meaning making in the same way that we were talking about image making when Tolkien is saying that. So not so much meaning making as making up meaning, but rather discovering meaning that we can do when we take each moment artfully, even those moments where we fall flat on our faces, or we're experiencing shame or meltdown or conflict. where is the art in that? Where's the sacredness even in that? And I think that that's part of what our current time is really needing and calling for, to be able to recognize the beauty and the suffering in that way.
Yeah, and it's the last point, because I keep coming back to it, and I've done a couple of solo shows on it, and I keep coming back to Tolkien and Lord of the Rings for it, that this stuff is real. It is some kind of real. And so if you've got to this point of the show, and like I'm so terrified that there are people's minds out there that are captured to the sense that they would and I've got Ursula Le Guin for them for this, but like would consider it escapism, but it's opposite. Like literally Tolkien himself wrestled with this for decades and came up with like, this is real. This is a kind of real thing in creation. So take it seriously. And honestly, as you say, like take expression seriously. Like the elves are conduits for beauty, but like the Ainur, all of these things are all participating in co-creation. It's a divine act. Cooking is participating in this kind of co-creation. Tweeting, unfortunately, is participating in this co-creation. And there's so much medicine available in this particular book from this particular man seen in this context that I think if you haven't encountered it yet, Becca's book, and hey, join me on the Audible journey if you want. I don't know. Take this seriously, because it's there's so much available to us heading into the next year and a half. I don't know. Anyway, this is a point that was my roundabout way of getting to, as I was putting together the notes for this, and I think I mentioned it before I hit the record button, but we spoke about On Fairy Stories and the creation myth that goes alongside Middle-earth in total, rather than specifically the Lord of the Rings. And then we've done a little bit of Lord of the Rings, but we've had a bunch of shows on that. And I wrote this down. Our responsibility to the world is sort of spelled out in, say, in the creation stories in general. I don't want to narrow it down into one bit of it. It's kind of like our guidelines on how to go about the world are in Lord of the Rings. And I know that's a 10,000 foot view, but that's kind of what I wanted to convey to people, that in the in Ainur Lindale and On Fairy Stories, we have an elevation of the imaginal and its role in the world, and we have going about a world that looks like that in Lord of the Rings. Was that fair? What would you add to that?
I think that they really are the alpha and the omega of Tolkien's cosmogony and of his legendarium. The cosmogony, or the Ainur Lindale, is the alpha, and Lord of the Rings, which depicts the ending and passing away of the Third Age, is the omega. And one of the most poignant parts of the creation myth, the Ainur Lindale, is what the role of human beings will be after the world itself has ended. And it's said in that creation myth that no music as great as the music of the Ainur had ever existed or would ever exist until the final music, when the world had reached completion, because then it wouldn't just be the Ainur creating music and singing with Iluvatar. That is when human beings, when the children of Iluvatar, would also join in the chorus and make it whole and complete. Part of why that music is greater is because what is being sung then is every act that every human being has ever done in their lives, for good or ill, or everything in between. And that all of that is adorning the music. We're all adorning the music of creation with our own inherent creativity. And if that isn't a call to literally let your voice sing and bring forth whatever form of creativity it is that is coming through you, as you were saying, whether it's cooking or poetry or simply how you observe the world when you go on a walk in the evening. All of that is adding to the music of creation that will make an even greater song in the end.
I think we're just going to finish up the show there. That is the ultimate medicine to leave people with. That's extremely well said. All right then. All right, Becca. Where do people go to find out more about yourself? What you got coming up? Obviously, the book will be in the show notes, but lay it on us.
Sure. Well, the easiest way to find out what I'm up to is my website. It's beccatarnas.com. And I have an events page there that says all the various places I'll be. I'm definitely having life dreams come true in terms of being able to travel to different places and give talks and, at young societies and different astrological things. So all of that's listed on the events page. And this book is available through Valor Press or through Amazon, however you choose to find it. And I'm also going to be bringing out another book that I'm editing. I'm not writing the whole thing. It's actually a journal issue for Archive, the Journal of Archetypal Cosmology. I've been hard at work editing the 7th issue, which is called Historical Roots and Current Flowerings. And it's different essays from a variety of authors on archetypal astrology and cosmology. So that should be out in a few weeks. I'm just giving it the final touches. So those are some of the things that I'm currently up to or I've just finished doing. And all of it can be found at beccatarnas.com.
Wonderful. Well, that's definitely all going to be in the show notes. And I love these conversations. Thank you so much. I'm weirdly excited about 2020, but thanks very much for your time.
Oh, likewise. It's so wonderful to speak with you. And maybe just one last thing on 2020 that, it is a time period where a lot seems to be peaking or coming to a head, where the divisions and challenges and so forth that we see in the world are maybe going to be hitting a higher pitch, but it's also a time where I think we have the capacity to rise to meet it. And that's where it isn't necessarily a time simply to despair, as we've been talking about, but rather to look, what is your small part that you can play, and what is the small part each of us can play to shoulder those tasks as individuals, as communities, and so on. And I'm actually, in some odd way, deriving a lot of hope from what is coming next year, not because I'm not also afraid of it, but because I do think we have the capacity to, we as a human species and we as parts of this Earth community have a capacity to actually rise to meet the challenges of our age. And whether we have the will is the question, but we certainly do have the ability.
Absolutely. All right. Well, once again, thank you very much.
Thank you too. Really lovely to speak with you.
It's funny. As I was editing this episode, I was reminded of something I learned from one of the many times I have listened to the audio commentaries of the extended Lord of the Rings films. Philippa Boyen's justification for having the elves show up at Helm's Deep in the Two Towers, which angered a lot of purists out there, as all things do. Her justification was that Sauron's forces were actually assaulting everyone from about that point in the story to the end of the War of the Ring, and it's just that the book follows the main characters through, as books tend to do. So it's not necessarily wrong to have them there. And in particular, she was referring to the Siege of Lorien and then the Battle of Mirkwood, because we're talking elves. And then later on, Sauron's forces also had the Men of Dale and the dwarves trapped inside the Lonely Mountain. And they actually only managed a last-minute rout after the ring was destroyed and the enemy forces sort of lost their nerve, which again, they put back into the Return of the King film, that idea that the ending of Sauron was what diminished all his armies all over the earth. But the more prosaic reality is that screenplays are structured differently to novels, right? And so in the case of the Lord of the Rings films, the writers stick almost timidly to a very classic screenplay structure as a way of wrestling Tolkien's story into an intelligible shape. So the elves are actually at Helm's Deep for a side effect of that, which was that they wanted Arwen there because you couldn't have your love story vanish for most of the film and all this kind of stuff. But they got that kind of right. But anyway, Philippa was correct, because those battles did indeed happen. Sauron's was an all-out war on reality. It was an inescapable moment in the history of Middle-earth. It doesn't matter where you were sort of on that famous map, right? And from a rhizomatic perspective, there is something encouraging in that. Wherever we are in the world, we are, in a sense, facing the same challenge or the same enemy. Particularly looking at 2020. And every opportunity to push back against disenchantment and despair contributes not just to your own, but to everyone else's victory. So as I was editing this show and thinking back on those, on all those times I listened to the audio commentary, it kind of made me realize, which may not surprise that many of you, but it's one of those things that is a self-aware galaxy brain moment of actually how much Tolkien influences my tactics and philosophy. And it is especially here. It's especially here in the battle against disenchantment and despair is everywhere. And don't ever think, wherever you are in the world, that your contribution isn't contributing. It is the one war. And Tolkien kind of saw that. And again, it sounds gloomy, but it's oddly encouraging. Until next time.